I'm 23, single, and living in the annex of a high school while making almost no money. Naturally, cooking's a bit of a challenge. That's why Blue Apron is so appealing. For an affordable price that negates the need to drive through rush hour traffic to the grocery store, where a third of what I'll buy will likely be thrown out in 2 weeks anyway, Blue Apron ships me exactly the ingredients I need to cook a meal far above my pay grade. It's quick, it's affordable, and it's tasty. For those of you like the three of us at Entitled to My Friend's Opinion, every cent and every second are needed. When that money and time is returned to you in such a delicious manner, it's irresponsible not to pounce. So, follow the link in this episode description to see what deals lie ahead for you at blueapron.com. We're here to change your opinion about your own cooking skills with the help of Blue Apron. Welcome back, Entitled family. We are happy to have you. This is Brian on the microphone tonight. I have the opportunity and pleasure of calling in a woman by the name of Mary Baudouin, who works out in Louisiana with the Jesuits in the central and southern province. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about that in just a second. But I'm really excited about the topic at hand, and I'd like to introduce Mary and bring her on the air to introduce herself before we go any further. Mary, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here with you and to talk about what I think is a really exciting way that where the Jesuits are involved in social justice.
As do I, and it's one that I was not aware of until last week when we spoke on the phone, Mary. And I've been Jesuit educated since age 15. 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, and now 1 year as a teacher, or in my first year as a teacher. So it's an exciting opportunity to learn and discuss what exactly it means to be a socially responsible investor and how the Jesuits can go beyond just the priestly vocation and to work with the public and work with the common good in a grander sense. But Mary's official title, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, but at least on the website, this is where I got it. You are the Assistant for Social Ministries of the U.S. Southern and Central Province of the Jesuits. Is that correct?
Well, it's actually the central and southern province. It's more like sounds more like a railroad company than a Jesuit province.
Yeah, really does. We're playing Monopoly. So that province it merged 4 or 5 years ago from the Missouri province and the Louisiana province.
Well, we merged 3 years ago, actually, and it was the New Orleans province.
That's right.
And the Missouri province that merged together.
And so for a little bit of background on what that all means for the listeners who are not necessarily familiar with the Jesuits and the way their organizational structure works in the United States. The Jesuits are an order of Catholic priests. They were founded in Spain in the early 1500s by St. Ignatius Loyola. He had the help of a few other saints, St. Francis Xavier, for instance, and Peter Faber, alongside some others. And they, long story short, came to the United States in, I believe it was the late 1700s, early 1800s, correct, Mary?
Yeah.
And were working as missionaries. So they did a lot of work with indigenous cultures and meeting them where they are at versus going in and eradicating their whole culture and building it back up. It's much more of a socially conscious type of ministry that the Jesuits have long practiced. And now they're famous in the United States primarily for their schools. Georgetown, Boston College are kind of the flagship Jesuit universities of the United States, but then St. Louis U, where this podcast began, is also one of the premier Jesuit universities. And in New Orleans by Mary, they have Loyola New Orleans, alongside about 20, 25 others to go with that. And then about a little over 50 different high schools as well that the Jesuits run. So their ministry is very urban-based, very person-based, and very ministry-focused. But like I said, I had no idea about this Jesuit Committee on Investment Responsibility until a week ago. So Mary, if you don't mind just kind of introducing us to the work you do with the JCIR and who they are exactly.
Okay. So every province in the United States and in what we used to call English-speaking in Canada, for about the last 25 years, has been involved with trying to figure out how we promote the faith that does justice. And we do that through legislative advocacy, through education. But for the last 25 years, we've also been doing it through corporate responsibility, where we use the investments of the Jesuits to try to influence corporate behavior in areas like human rights, environmental concerns, access to drugs is something we've done in the past. We try to do that in collaboration with Jesuits around the world who, with the people they serve, when they're experiencing particular problems. For example, child labor in India was one, or access to AIDS retroviral drugs in Africa, or human rights concerns with oil companies in both Africa and South America. Jesuits have brought those to the attention of the Jesuits in the United States and Canada to see if there's anything that we could do about it. And come to find out, there is something we can actually do about that. We also work very closely in collaboration with a lot of other religious orders. So it's not just the Jesuits who are doing this. There's many other orders of Catholic religious women, Catholic religious men, and different faith groups who have formed. This really came out of involvement with the whole apartheid issue in South Africa. But they band together to form an organization called the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. I think they just celebrated their 40th anniversary. And all of those different orders, there's 300 members of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. The Jesuits are just one of those 300 groups that try to use their investments to make corporate change.
That's fantastic. And even the web of connection, I didn't realize how far that extends. So, with the Jesuits being a priestly order, for listeners who might assume that they're at the pulpit or behind the altar, what does it look like for the Jesuits and the people who work for the Jesuits? Someone like you or I who works for the Jesuits, not as a Jesuit priest or brother, obviously, but as an employee for them. What's it look like to be on the ground still living that mission?
Well, I think that certainly the documents of the Jesuits, it really, especially since their General Congregation, what they call General Congregation 32, there was a strong commitment that the mission of the Jesuits is to promote the faith that does justice. And I think they've spent a number of years trying to figure out what does that practically mean. And one of the things that it practically means for them is that they want every province in the world, so there's not just provinces in the United States, but every region in the world is organized into geographic provinces. And every one of those provinces is supposed to have somebody like me, a Social Ministries coordinator, provincial assistant for Social Ministries, and a Social Ministries Commission. And so this is something that the work for the faith that does justice is something that's happening all over the world. In the United States and Canada, we have a particular advantage because there are laws in place, processes in place that allow shareholders to influence corporations if you have like a certain amount of funds in those corporations. And so so my colleagues and I, through the Jesuit Commission on Investment Responsibility, we identify particular areas and particular companies that we want to try to influence and make small investments in those companies. so that then we are able to use these small investments to try to influence. I don't know if I answered your question. Did I?
Yeah, I mean, the question was quite open-ended, and I'm glad it went that way.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
because I was about to head there anyway, and talking about the mission of the JCIR, and I'm going to read that mission real quickly so we can get just the terms down, and obviously you know them. I'm familiar with the terms at least, if not how they're used here, but the JCIR mission reads: the Jesuit community on investment and responsibility advocates for corporate behavior that is consistent with Catholic social teaching through dialogues with corporations, shareholder resolutions, and proxy voting. And just to break that down a little bit further, the end goal is for this consistent corporate behavior, and the consistency it shares is that with Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is a set of, would you call it doctrine, Mary, or would you call it more guidelines?
Yeah. It is doctrine. I mean, the basis of it is a number of encyclicals that have been written by popes since the 1890s, where they apply our faith to the signs of the times and the problems of the world, and so how does our faith then call us to respond?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that summary. Said much more clearly than I would have ever gotten around to. And from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is essentially the highest office of the Catholic Church in the United States itself until you get to the Vatican, there are 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. So these 7 themes are what the type of behavior that the JCIR is really hoping to instill within these corporations. The first is life and dignity of the human person. Second is call to family, community, and participation. Third is rights and responsibilities. Fourth, option for the poor and vulnerable. 5, the dignity of work and the rights of workers. 6, solidarity. And 7, care for God's creation. So those 7 themes are the type of behavior that JCIR is looking for, correct?
Yes, we are.
Great.
And I mean, I can point to some specific instances where we're working on. I'll try to point out some of those themes as we go forward, and how those come to life in our engagements with those companies.
That'd be fantastic, and we'll work toward that in just a minute here. The one question that just came up, I didn't necessarily plan for this, but as I'm reading it, some of these themes seem inconsistent with the way in which American capitalism is often practiced. In particular, option for the poor and vulnerable does not always seem to be at the forefront of most corporations' minds, nor does the dignity of work and the rights of workers, as we've seen from these massive corporations that outsource a lot of their work to sweatshops over in Africa or Asia where labor is cheap. And care for God's creation, that's getting a little bit better recently in terms of environmental care, but still has a ways to go. So in that sense, how does it work to have these corporations buying into these 7 themes that might not jibe with their capitalistic goals?
Okay. Well, we would have to do that through. We couldn't look at all 7 themes. What we would do is we would pick a particular issue that we would want that company to address.
Okay.
Let me just give you an example. Monsanto, which is based in St. Louis, a large agricultural company, one of the things that we found is that their suppliers were using child labor, particularly in India. And so what we did was, what the Jesuits did, again, along with other faith-based shareholders, was made a small investment in Monsanto, and that allowed us to file a shareholder resolution. And the shareholder resolution that we filed was around having Monsanto adopt a human rights policy that it would then implement not just throughout their company, but also throughout their supply chain. And I mean, this is a very long process. It's not like you file a shareholder resolution it gets adopted, and then everything is fine. The old Missouri province was engaged with Monsanto for 10 years, which is, and finally just ended that that engagement last year when we felt like they really had made some progress. Now, Monsanto is not a perfect company, and there's still a lot of other issues that other shareholders are working on. But one of the things that we felt had been put in place is that Monsanto then began to put in methodologies and regulations and staff to monitor those human rights issues that we brought to their attention. So one of the things, so then they reported on that to shareholders through regular dialogues that we had with them. And we felt really good that they had adopted a good code, I guess it's like a code of ethics, and a way of ensuring that that code of ethics got implemented, at least in the area of human rights. And again, the particular area that we were concerned about was child labor, which, from their reporting to us, we felt convinced that they had taken enough actions in their own company, but particularly with their suppliers, to eradicate child labor in the areas where it was being used.
Yeah, great, and that's a really helpful explanation of how Catholic social teaching has very directly been the driving force behind those negotiations and those end goals. And one thing that you mentioned is not just one thing, but one of the pivotal components of this type of negotiation are shareholder resolutions. And if you don't mind, so we used to record this podcast in St. Louis University's business school. And that's the only time I ever stepped foot in the business school. So I'm as unfamiliar with this type of negotiation as about anybody could be, and I'm sure some listeners will be as well. So if you don't mind just kind of explaining the strategy of a shareholder resolution and the outcomes that result from it.
Sure. So to file a shareholder resolution, at least right now, now this may be changing in the future because there's some bills that have been introduced in Congress to change how this is done. But right now, if you own $2,000 or 2,000 shares of stock, you are out, and you have owned that for a full year, you are eligible to file a shareholder resolution that will then go before every shareholder and the board of directors during when what they call a proxy statement is sent out. And every year, every corporation has to hold an annual meeting, and there are proxy resolutions that get voted on either by mail or in person at that annual meeting. The shareholder resolutions they're very meticulous in how those have to be filed. They can be no more than 500 words. They have to fit within the guidelines of the Securities Exchange Commission, or the SEC. And one of the important things is that they cannot ask a company to not do business as usual. For example, we could not ask, say, Exxon to stop drilling. But we could ask Exxon to do things like to consider having a portion of their business go towards alternative energy sources. That's just one example. So we file these resolutions. I just say that the companies do not want those resolutions to go before all of their shareholders and all of their board members. So one of the first things they'll do is to try to get the SEC to kick it out. But but the members of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility have gotten very, very good at filing shareholder resolutions that don't get kicked out. So then what happens is that at least the strategy that we've been using of late, and that our other faith-based colleagues have been using, is we may agree, I should put it that way, to withdraw the shareholder resolution in exchange for sitting down with company leaders, particularly those who have responsibility for the particular concerns and issues that we are dealing with, and to enter into a dialogue so that we can begin to see how they would implement our resolution, even if it doesn't go before all of the shareholders. So that's the best case scenario.
Okay.
If the company refuses to go into dialogue, or we feel like it's a resolution that should go before all of the shareholders, for some reason, maybe it's for educational purposes or to bring certain issues to light, then those would actually be voted on by shareholders. And if they have to get at least the first year that you would file it, they'd have to get at least 3% of the vote of all of the shareholders. If that happens, then you can file it again the next year, and then you would have to get at least 7% of the vote of all shareholders. And then in the third year, you would need to get at least 10% of the vote of all shareholders.
Okay.
There are mechanisms that can be used to influence shareholders, and so we will often try to use those mechanisms where we get, say, money managers who would vote on proxy, who vote shareholders' proxies for them to try to vote, in favor of our resolution. We've had much higher percentages than that, and once that happens, then the company is really interested in dialoguing with you. They don't want it to come up again.
Okay, I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Was that clear? Okay.
No, that was perfectly clear. And it sounds almost like as if it's the minority representation that is quite inherent to American negotiation.
Yeah, we're definitely minority.
Yeah, and I would imagine, and some of the pushback I could imagine that you all might hear is that, let's go back to the Exxon example.
Sure.
So their demands left and right for no more coal, no more oil. And
Sure.
Those people who are demanding that, I can imagine them claiming to the JCIR, oh, you're not going far enough. What's the response to that complaint?
You mean people who are looking in from the outside?
Yeah.
Okay.
And who are demanding that, no, you should tell Exxon that you can't drill.
Yeah. Well, there's other ways of doing that. I mean, there's protest movements, there's boycott movements, there's divestment. I mean, you could ask companies to pull out, or you could ask an organization to pull out all of their investments from fossil fuels, which is happening in many parts of the world, and including some of our schools, and actually the Canadian province divested from fossil fuels.
Okay.
Our belief is that, we can understand how that, that is one approach. There's, the approach where you protest, and, it's uncomfortable sometimes to go through a picket line when you're going into an annual meeting to make a statement. I have to say, sometimes I'm hanging my head.
Yeah.
But we are talking with major leaders of the corporation, and so we have this. It gives us unprecedented access to do advocacy in another way, and um, I mean, I'll give you just one simple example. Um, one of the, or two of the companies that we are involved with right now are private prison companies. And we have gotten them to adopt, through resolutions, to adopt to adopt human rights policies. And now we're trying to get them to actually implement those human rights policies. There's many faith groups that say that private prisons, that people should divest from private prisons, particularly faith groups. That nobody should be making a profit off of the misery of incarcerating offenders and immigrant detainees. At the same time, there's 160,000 people in private prisons and immigration centers, immigration detention centers, and we feel like we can be a voice for them, whereas they would not have other voices. So if we can be a voice for them, we feel like that's a good use of our energy and our time, even though it may seem just antithetical to everything that we as faith-based participants believe in. We also believe that we can be a strong voice.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is also just an obligation from your end to meet both corporations and the people they serve where they're at. To not come in and say there's one concrete way of doing all these things and that every case is the same, but rather to go case by case and assess from there how the most change can happen as efficiently as possible. Is that right?
Yeah. It's every single dialogue is different, even if it's a company. We dialogued. I guess this is really before I came on, but we dialogued with a number of drug companies, particularly around access to drugs and patents to drugs, and every single one of those companies was a very different approach, because you're dealing with people at those companies. You're dealing with their own rules and regulations, and so you have to be real flexible when you go into a dialogue. I mean, it's a dialogue, right? That means you have to listen to both sides, even though sometimes you might really radically disagree with some of the ways that they're doing business.
Yeah, and how is it when you have to engage in a conversation like that? That's something I know. I talked to my class today, actually. We were talking about the Charlottesville protests and the various reactions to those. We watched a clip of the Vice documentary and then watched Father James Martin give his vilification of neo-Nazism. And I had them talk about the ways in which those videos might be interpreted. So this isn't something reserved only to JCIR, those in the business world, where you have to listen to the opposition. But what is that feeling? And then how do you keep your cool, I guess, to put it bluntly, in those situations when you hear something that goes against not only Catholic social teaching, but I assume it happens where somebody might say something that goes against the public image. Someone within the corporation says something that contradicts what the public image of the company claims itself to be.
Yeah, it's hard, but we also know that if we totally shut them down, trash what they're doing, they're never going to listen to us. We're not going to get anywhere. So, like I said, it's a really slow process, and I would have to say sometimes it's a really painful process. It's I had a colleague from another province who once said, when I walk out of that dialogue, sometimes I feel like I just need to take a shower.
Yeah.
It's just because it's, you feel like, am I compromising too much? But I have to say that one of the things I don't think we ever compromise is our values and our commitment to human dignity, to care for creation, to the rights of workers. I've been involved in now 4 dialogues personally And I've never seen anybody at that table make those kinds of compromises. The way that we do compromise is probably on how the fact that knowing that the process is going to be so incredibly slow.
Yeah.
And that, like I said, we worked with Monsanto for 10 years. We worked with another company. We just finished an engagement with another company where it was a 7-year engagement. So it's incredibly slow, and often we have a difficult time getting the information that we want to get.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And I'd like to touch on the idea of advocacy, because advocacy often is kind of pigeonholed to a very loud movement and a very aggressive movement and these types of demands for justice. And I think that's absolutely a legitimate form of advocacy. But what I'm hearing from you is an alternative approach to advocacy. And even you said the type of access you gain is another type of advocacy. Do you have a definition of advocacy, or do you have a few ideas of what advocacy might be, if not a single thing?
I think it's often speaking out with and for people or situations where rights are not being adhered to, and trying to reach a point where either through laws or through practices that those rights are upheld. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. And so you may be working at times with, like you said, with legislators, or it might be working with companies or city councils, but it's speaking out on behalf of an issue or people whose rights have been violated, and that you want you want to make amends there.
Yeah, I love that definition, because it allows for a type of advocacy that is in the same way the JCIR is with each of its corporations. This advocacy for any group that depends not upon just the end, but also the way of getting to that end, and it takes into consideration all of the possibilities. So thank you for that, Mary. And I'd like to talk now just about some of the other organizations you've worked with and the types of impacts they've had on these documents that you've sent me. The Jesuit Committee on Investment Responsibility annual reviews of 2015 and 2016. There are 5 that are highlighted. Bungie Limited, Ingredion, which are both water sustainability corporations, and then the Geo Group, which is the private prison group you've talked about, the Monsanto Group, which you already discussed at length, and then the Aura Minerals Inc. group. What are some of these processes like? I'll let you pick whatever one you're most comfortable talking about and which one you think people would most want to hear about. But what are some of the changes that you've seen besides just those at Geo or Monsanto, and how sustainable are those changes?
Okay. Well, let me start with the one that we just finished, a 7-year engagement with the Fungi Corporation, and that was one that our province led. We started off with the New Orleans province, and then we continued that as the new Central and Southern province. And we were actually asked to engage with them by the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, who knew the way that the Jesuits work, that we do in-depth work with companies, and we're not involved in lots of companies. We're usually only involved with 5 at a time, but we try to go really deep into those companies. And so there were issues around water sustainability, that this is a large agribusiness, and they are working in a lot of water-stressed areas, and they have lots of different supply chains that supply grain to them. So initially what we wanted them to do was to just develop a policy on water sustainability and a way of setting up metrics that could be measured on how they were making improvements on curtailing some of their water usage and the water usage of their supply chains, particularly in water-stressed areas, but also in the whole area of pollution. And they were a little nervous at first. They did have a vice president who was really interested in these issues. I remember that after the first year that we were involved with them, he said, "I've read 17 books on water over the last year."
Yeah.
We thought that was pretty, that's pretty good. He really took this seriously. But we always had the corporate lawyer who was there just to make sure they weren't going to do, we weren't going to ask them to do anything that was going to get them in trouble legally. And we had their public relations officer who was also at every one of their meetings. And slowly they began to make changes. And so, I'll just give you one example of a change. The very first year, every year, one of the things that we do with all of the companies that we're involved in is that we go and we make a statement at their annual meeting. And often we try to get a Jesuit to make the statements because, I could say the same exact thing that a Jesuit would say, but he's going to get listened to much better than I am.
Yeah, with the collar.
But every year, and I'm really okay with that because what we're trying to do is make the changes, and however you get those changes made. And so if we need to have a Jesuit make the statement, we do. And so we've had Jesuits involved in every one of our dialogues with the company. But the very first annual meeting was there to make a statement. They had about 2 sentences about their commitment to environmental responsibility. Now, 7 years later, when we made our final statement just this past May, a third of the CEO's address to those who were present at the annual meeting, a third of it was on sustainability.
Oh my God, that's 7 years later.
That is a huge change in that company. The PR person who, was there to kind of, at the very beginning, is now a vice president for sustainability. And that's his primary responsibility. And he's reporting directly to the CEO. They've set up an environmental, a sustainability committee of the board whose sole responsibility is to ensure that the company has more sustainable practices, not just in the area of water, but also in the broader carbon footprint. And that the head of that committee, who is also a board member, is Carol Browner, who is a former EPA head under the Clinton administration. Yeah. She also worked in the Obama administration. So those are some major changes that they've made. They had, at this last meeting, they had a whole brochure on their sustainability goals for the next 10 years. And they were significantly more than we initially asked for. So we're just really excited about what they're doing. They've also made huge improvements in the way that they're reporting about water usage. For example, one of the things that we asked them to do for every time we met with them, we would meet with them twice a year, and at their annual meeting, we asked them to sign on to something called the United Nations CEO Water Mandate, which is an effort by the United Nations to get the chief executive officers of major companies to make strong commitments in the area of water sustainability and to report on that. And in 2015, they signed onto that, and they were the first agribusiness to do so. They've also just done a number of other things. They've become leaders in sustainability efforts. And they joined, for example, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They are doing, and they've also committed to zero deforestation in their operations, which is a major commitment. So we've seen that company not only make internal changes, but then also become an external leader with other business leaders, and particularly with other agribusinesses in the whole area of sustainability, and particularly water sustainability.
That's amazing. And with all that considered, how much of these changes that JCIR and you all try to implement, how much depend on legislation to be put into practice? Is it more peer pressure from you guys and other shareholders, or is it also to meet standards set by Congress?
Yeah, I would say that, there may be some standards, although, now that we pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, that's not as strong.
You read my mind.
But these are more internal goals that they've set for themselves. So it's not as much, because this, I have to say, like for this company, it's an international company, so some U.S. laws are not going to apply to them, which is why signing on to this UN mandate, where it's a global effort, was so significant for them.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. Just on an American and person note, that's encouraging, and optimistic. So one other thing that I really wanted to talk about that you'd mentioned in passing in our conversation last week was about Jesuits working in indigenous cultures. And I don't know exactly how that relates to JCIR, if that relates to JCIR, but do you mind expanding a little bit on that role of the Jesuits?
Sure. Well, and again, this happens in, I'm not talking about Jesuits working with Native American communities here in the United States, although there is a possibility that we may be getting involved in a shareholder resolution that would be related to DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which I think would be related to financing of that. But particularly in Central America, South America, the Jesuits work real closely with indigenous people there. And one group that we worked group of Jesuits that we were working really closely with were in Honduras, and they're working with people whose lives have been turned upside down by mining companies, extractive industries, particularly. And so some of these mining companies were doing is going in, taking the land from, which probably the indigenous people, you don't have papers, or a mortgage saying that you own the land, but your people have been on this land for centuries.
Yeah.
So they're taking this land, and then the mining was causing all kinds of pollution in the streams that provide their drinking water, their farming water, and people were getting really sick. But they were also, in protesting the taking of the land, there was violence that was committed against them, and not just so much by the company itself, but by the police and the government and the security companies that these companies hired to protect the mining work that they were doing. So one of the companies that we're working with right now is Aura Minerals, which is a Canadian company that's doing gold mining. I think it's gold mining. It might be copper. I'm not exactly sure. But it's a mineral, and we're trying to a human rights policy that would have them um, become more committed to the human rights of people in the areas that they are mining in. So, things like not polluting their water, not making it unhealthy for people to live there, and not taking their land.
Cool. And with the ultimate hope, obviously, of being similar to what Bungie has become, a leader within that industry, correct?
Yeah, we got a little ways to go on that one.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, is that done through a separate organization, or in conjunction with other organizations, in the sense that JCIR focuses on United States and Canada-based companies, but obviously they're doing work elsewhere? Is it just where the company's based that you're concerned with, and then you'll do the outreach type of awareness wherever they end up going? If that makes sense.
See, the Securities and Exchange Commission laws only apply to Canada and U.S. companies.
Yeah.
We couldn't go with we have companies that are international. We work with international companies, or companies that work internationally, but they are based in the U.S. and Canada.
Okay. And then.
So, if we had for example, if we had a Chinese company, we would not be able to do the same kind of thing because the laws, around, say, Chinese companies would be really different than what we have here in the United States and Canada.
I gotcha. Okay, cool. With all of that in mind, just kind of as we wrap up, one thing that I'd like to focus on in this next string of podcast episodes is the idea of sustainability and sustainable change. And Mary, how long have you been with JCIR?
For 14 years.
You personally have been?
Yes.
So in those 14 years, what's the level of sustainability that you've seen, given that the focus is not necessarily on quantity, but on the quality and the depth of these different corporations? How has that paid off over this long term?
Well, I think the companies are. What we're trying to do is to sort of, and I know that just our little intervention isn't the only thing that does it, but we're trying to get the company to change its culture, so that the issues that we're concerned about become a part of the culture of the company and a part of the structure of the company. For example, Monsanto has I don't know if it's a whole department, but they have a person whose sole job is to monitor human rights for that company. When we first started working with them, that wasn't even in their consciousness. The same way that Bungie now has a sustainability committee of the board. So we don't have to put the outside pressure on them anymore. It's part of their structure and how they operate and how they'll operate moving forward. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do is how do you get this more ingrained in the culture and the structure and the management processes of the company.
Which is kind of an underlying tone of subsidiarity within all of these interventions. Then this self-sustenance.
Yeah, absolutely, the principle of subsidiarity. I just want to say too, before we close, just for other listeners, is that one of the things that we also do is that we try to vote proxies. So that we try to vote for shareholder resolutions that maybe the Jesuits haven't filed, but that other groups have filed. Some of them are faith-based groups, others are pension funds. And this is something that you don't have to be an organization to do. Anybody who's a shareholder is going to get proxies and should be voting their proxies, but particularly looking for some of those social justice, human rights, environmental sustainability concerns in those proxies and voting the proxies. If you're a shareholder, you have power to at least to try to make changes through voting for those proxies.
Awesome, Mary. Thank you for that note to kind of close us out. I love that. I love the idea of people being able to get hands-on and make their own change. And I'd just like to mention too, before we head out, I met Mary in July when Mary came to talk to the Alumni Service Corps about the power of civil discourse. And to have you come on the show, Mary, and talk about the concrete examples in which civil discourse can make a lasting, tangible impact in our world is so cool to hear, because it can be lost in abstraction a lot, that we're sitting in a room and we're talking about things but not necessarily getting off that armchair and accomplishing anything. So I want to emphasize how much I appreciate that, and what a great example it is to have you and others with the Jesuits, with the JCIR, with the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, and other organizations like it, and even those individual shareholders, making that very real difference.
Yeah, it's exciting. If you can get excited over really long term,
Yeah.
waiting really long term.
Yeah.
But we have seen real differences. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, Mary, thank you so much for calling in, and making the time for this to happen. I know I've really enjoyed it. I hope listeners enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you ever have anything else you'd like to share with us, just let me know and we'd be happy to.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Mary. And with that, we close out for the week. Everybody will be back soon. Thank you for listening. You can find more information about the JCIR online. We can put some links on the website. And with that, we hope you have a great one. See you next time.